Okay, I'll shut the sound.
No one ever told me to do this, which I realized.
So I'm just gonna have everyone introduce themselves.
Okay.
If that's cool with y'all. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for helping. Start.
Hey,
Yeah, you guys
Megan.
can start whenever
Nice to
you're
meet you.
ready. Just let us speak each other.
Hello?
Oh, great.
Hey.
Bad.
Oh, hello. Ooh. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Silent Barn, what is it called? Public discussion? Public meeting on safer spaces. There we go. My name is Kate Watkins. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. I work with a feminist collective called For the Birds, and I co-edit a zine called International Girl Gang Underground. And I've worked with safer spaces a bit in my own work. We're just gonna go down the line and have everyone introduce themselves and talk briefly about their interactions with safer spaces.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I work at in the hardcore collective at ABC No Rio since 2000.
Hi, my name is Megan. I am a musician. I primarily perform within the noise scene, which is a very kind of white, straight, male aggression sort of vibe. I'm also part of a feminist experimental music collective called LLXM, and I'm kind of here to talk about the issues I see in my own scene and what we could do to kind of improve upon that.
Hi, I'm Susie. I'm also a musician. I play in a band called J.D. Hawkins, and we almost never play for audiences full of straight white men. I mean, it's like a very intentional scene. So I guess my other experience, I write zines and I do comics, and my safer space experience has been, I've done safer spaces for random shows and parties, and also a long stint at Occupy Wall Street. I don't want to talk about that right now.
I feel that. I was there too. Hi, my name is Leah. I work at the Support New York, which is a collective here in New York that does work around consent education and community accountability. I also, with Susie, worked with the Safer Spaces Working Group at Occupy Wall Street, worked on the community agreement there, which is kind of like a safer space policy, a broad one. So I was involved in that. I work with the New York City Coalition for Safer Spaces and generally kind of help people language for safer space policies, and that's enough.
Pass it back. Okay, cool. So I think we decided that something that would be helpful for the room to do before we really get into, conversational dialogue about safer spaces is to put out there one working definition of safer spaces. So Leo was going to read the New York City Safer Spaces Coalition's definition of safer spaces. So that we just have something to jump off of, and then we can I think we're going to go down the row and talk to people about what their definition of a safer space is and try to jump off from there.
All right, so I'm reading off the Coalition for Safer Spaces website, just to give us kind of a very broad general definition that I think is pretty accurate. So a safer space is a supportive, non-threatening environment that encourages open-mindedness, respect, and a willingness to learn from others, as well as physical and mental safety. It is a space that is critical of the power structures that affect our everyday lives, and where power dynamics, backgrounds, and the effects of our behavior on others are prioritized. It's a space that strives to respect and understand survivors' specific needs. Everyone who enters a safer space has a responsibility to uphold the values of the space. We say safer, realizing that not everyone experiences spaces in the same way as others, so any one set of guidelines established to create safety may not meet the requirements of everyone. And there may be complications Generally, safer spaces are welcoming, engaging, and supportive. Establishing guidelines for conditions that are not acceptable in a space and action plans for what one will do if those conditions arise is part of being proactive in creating a safer space. Issues like hurtful language and behavior, both within the space itself and in patterns extending beyond activities of the space, violence, touching people without their consent, intolerance of someone's religious beliefs or lack thereof, and just straight up being creepy, sleazy, racist, ageist, sexist, heterosexist, transphobic, able-bodyist, classist, sizist, or exhibiting any other behavior or language that may perpetuate oppression may be addressed with the safer space policy.
So that was a lot of words. I also wanted to mention before we got started, in other similar discussions that I've been a part of and that some of us have been a part of, it's been helpful at least to mention in the beginning that if anyone is triggered in any way during this conversation, that you should feel free to come speak with some of us if you felt uncomfortable. I am happy to name myself as one of those people that you can come talk to. If anyone else is comfortable, raise their hand. And we can chat later about that. But so as a jumping off point, I wanted to ask everyone on the panel what your definition of a safer space is. And go.
You're looking at me, I have to start. Okay, I think that the Coalition for Safer Spaces gives like a very broad but good definition. I think what's important is kind of recognizing that there has to be some flexibility in each space, but understanding what the needs are in each space is important. Who's there? What is the history? I think history is really important when you're talking about safer spaces, but thinking about interactions. But I think there are some general principles that are usually really helpful, like using consent practices. And I think what's really important is just there being a space for people to kind of like express what needs there might be and be able to like make decisions. You can't have a safer space without people being able to like actively make decisions, feel capable of doing that. So I think you have to recognize the power dynamics that are present in the world and how they can exist in any particular space and how they might particularly manifest. And you can kind of find a way to work with a group of people to come to a series of agreements that can work against as best you can those structures within that space. But I think it's also important to recognize sort of the underlying informal dynamics that are there. This is all very broad, but I think you kind of have to be flexible and to look at kind of what those broad systemic issues are, like racism, sexism, et cetera, that I read out before, and kind of think about how they work in the space.
That was a pretty good definition, I'd have to say. I think when a lot of people think of safer spaces, they think of individual acts, individual interactions, and individual boundaries, which I think are very important. Like everyone stresses consent and stuff and like not being touchy-feely where it's not wanted, but I also think it's like fostering an environment that isn't straight up like, I don't know, hostile. I mean, within reason, I guess. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who's actively like kicked people out of shows for violent behavior, for, you know, just saying plain fucked up shit. So, I don't know. It's also like, yeah, it requires a lot of flexibility, but it's also, there's something intuitive about what makes a space safe, I suppose. I don't even know if I believe there is like a space that's completely neutral or like objectively safe. I don't really believe in that concept, but I think it's really about like being very perceptive, keeping your eyes out, and also like trusting the people that are around you, or I don't know, trying to gauge like who you can trust. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much on board with what they've said so far. I think my personal concern, and I think it's shared by a lot of women and men that I know within my scene, is that I don't really make music in an environment that has that climate right now. And sometimes it does. I go to a lot of shows where it does feel very open and accepting. And then there are a lot of festivals where it's just like over the top bro-y. And it's hard to even initiate this conversation because there's just this initial knee-jerk response against it. And my concern and my, my whole reason for being here and things that I want to bring up in this discussion are how do we get that started when people hear the term safer spaces and automatically are just like, feminist bullshit. What do we do when we have to deal with that? So I'm asking a question, I guess, more than giving a statement. But that's kind of the concern with safer spaces for me is how do we start? Yeah. I feel like I didn't answer the question. But
That's totally fine.
Well, I think I'm in the wrong place. There's a whole bunch of feminist bullshit. At ABC, we define the guidelines for our safe space are no sexism, racism, or homophobia. And the problem with that is that it's kind of a vague definition, but at the same time, the strength of it is that it's simple, and you can kind of categorize other things that have come up since the 1980s, and in like DIY culture and the punk scene, like transphobia, for example, wasn't really like a prominent topic in the 1980s when they started doing shows there, and we sort of just lumped that in with homophobia at ABC Norio. We also lump in xenophobia in with racism, and I think a big pitfall of our safe space policy is the loose, definition of it. It's a collective, collective members come and go, and sometimes, the problem is that one member will see it a different way, and another member will see, what constitutes bad behavior in a different light, and that's usually most of the problems that we have, but that's how we still define it.
Cool. I think those are really helpful responses from everyone. I definitely want to get into like how to bring this conversation up when you feel so antagonized about it, for sure. Really quickly, since we're talking about definitions still, I know that it might be helpful for some people to talk about the use of the term safer spaces versus safe spaces. I noticed that in my little world of being an activist who planned shows and other like cultural events where I had to keep safe spaces in mind, that it was almost like it was such a quick leap from calling them safe spaces to safer spaces, and it might be helpful just to talk about that a little bit. In the definition that Leah read out loud, it mentioned that essentially no one can really be the judge of whether a space is safe for a certain person or not. I think that's really the core of where that comes from. There's like a lot of different axes of like identities and oppressions, and I think the idea is that no one can really judge what anyone else's experience is going to be. But if there's anything anyone wants to add to that, I'd be interested to hear.
I mean, the one, I guess, consistent problem that has come up, like in doing safer spaces or enacting safer spaces policies, is that a lot of the responsibility is on like the offended party, in particular, to like come forward. And often what I've had to do is mediate situations, and I think that like, it's a lot easier to like just throw someone out of a party or a show. But actually the hardest part is having to mediate these situations. And also what's important is that like people who are conducting safer spaces efforts be very well versed in various oppressions, which has also become a problem. You might have I know that I've like definitely had incidents where people like might have said like racist and xenophobic things either in their song lyrics or like on stage. They might have cracked jokes and stuff, and some people would feel super grossed out and leave and then tell me after the show and I'd be like, oh, damn, I could have, I totally would have done something about that. Like, I guess we're not booking a show with them ever again, but I don't know, I think it's good to also not just posit Safer Spaces efforts as like a way to, I don't know, to block out all of like the bad influences, but to, I guess also foster an environment where people can also try and like work with them, or at least as far as people are willing to cooperate, people who've said shitty things or done shitty things.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point, and I think it's one that's really relevant. And the reason I kind of keep coming back to the noise scene that I'm involved with is it's very much a presence here at Silent Barn. And yet, in a lot of ways, the mentality is a little bit different than a lot of people who are kind of involved in the organizing. The mentality is there's so much more ingrained misogyny. And I have conversations with other women who are attending these shows and playing these shows all the time where we're tired of dealing with this stuff. There's like not just one isolated incident in a night, but it's just kind of this overriding culture. And there's not any sense that there's anyone you can come to. It's kind of just, if you're into that kind of music, the assumption is you're just gonna suck it up and deal with like all this stuff that goes with it. And I think that would be a really good step one to kind of establish that somebody gives a shit, somebody is here. And I think that's why it would be so important for this space in particular and for other spaces to kind of establish that as this overriding idea. Yeah.
One thing I think that's maybe like surfacing out of what folks are saying, and something I want to point out that's in one of the zines in the back that y'all should check out, which is a really awesome zine table in the back. But I was just skimming through one, and I think it makes a really important point that there really is no pure safety under a capitalist system that thrives on racism, sexism, and all these kind of structures of oppression that we live under. So it's impossible to say that we're going to get to some pure safe space. I really like the idea of safer because it just feels like trying and striving, and I think it's an imperfect activity, and I think that's what's important in this world is, I think you can fail in trying and do really terrible things, so I don't want to say trying is enough, but I think it just shows that people are trying to, in this sort of experimental kind of model, trying to get towards something that will, oppose those structures that exist.
So I want to ask you a little bit about EVC kind of already having this policy in place, because we're talking about like, what do you do when there's not anything in place? So I'm just wondering, like, do contentions still come up like over the safer space policy there, and what is that like?
We get flack for it all the time, and a lot of people even write off ABC and Oreo as a venue nowadays because they remember the days of 2003 to 2009 when apparently, although not to my knowledge, the place was overrun by PC fascists. And there was definitely some what's the word? There was an air of superiority with the bookers and some of the volunteers during that era, but I don't think anything was done out of line in terms of enforcing the safe space policy. And I guess safer space policy does sound a little more verbally accurate, because I agree with what you guys said. There's not really, it's kind of like an ideal to be worked towards, but not a reality that can, that's, in the near future attainable. So I see what you're saying. We'll probably keep using the language safe space at ABC because our building's probably going to get torn down in the next 3 months, and maybe we can reevaluate everything when our new building goes up. But yeah, no.
Like boo, yay?
Yeah.
New building? That's good.
It's been a problem with, especially because most of the collective that I work with is the Hardcore Punk Collective, And there's other collectives within the building, but we obviously only deal with hardcore and punk shows. And then some of the members of our collective branch out into other collectives, you know, but the focus and the safe space policy really only applies to the hardcore punk collective, because in the other collectives it kind of just goes without saying. It's not really a necessity. It's never really been. It hasn't really needed to be enforced in any of the other collectives.
Is that because the other collectives are doing more like private work? Is it, or is, just because I'm thinking like, okay, well, if you're doing a hardcore punk collective, that's like open public events, right? So are the other collectives like more private, or?
Yeah, the other collectives in the building are the photography, the dark room, the silk screening lab, books through bars, the zine library, the computer lab, and Time's Up.
Okay.
The bicycle advocacy group is in the basement.
Cool. So I had a bunch of like questions that I had written for this panel, but I feel like in the direction that it's going, we're talking about more tangible like solutions to things. So I think it might be more helpful to just talk about like how do these discussions start and how do we maintain safer spaces, really. It seems like that would be a productive focus. So I wanted to directly respond to your question about like how do you have this conversation. In one way, I can't speak to having like going to a festival and feeling really frustrated. I wouldn't specifically even know how to handle that. For me, in my life, what it meant was taking control of the situations that I was already in. And if I were booking a show, then I would be like, okay, I'm calling up New York City Coalition for Safer Spaces. I'm gonna have someone announce in the beginning that this is a safer space, whether that's me or whether that's them. And they actually, in this and in other, New York City's Coalition for Safer Spaces is a group that exists in New York. So that's a really amazing, helpful resource for anyone in this room, anyone that books things in New York. And they are who I have called when I've wanted to book shows and I've wanted to make it just a better environment. And what they have done also is that the members of the collective would come wearing pink armbands and identify themselves at the beginning of the show and say, hey, just so you know, we're here. This is what the Safer Spaces policy for this show is. And if anything arises that you're uncomfortable with, please come and see one of us. We have pink armbands on. So in that way, it's giving you a tangible place to go to be heard if you're feeling targeted, or like Susie mentioned before, like if someone was like, this band said a fucked up xenophobic thing, you would have someone to go talk to actually specifically and say, this thing happened and I'm not comfortable with it. So yeah, I don't know, does anyone else have any other like tangible experiences where they feel like they were able to bring up these conversations when they potentially weren't already happening?
I have some examples. I'm thinking about, like, right now I'm working with folks in the National Lawyers Guild for their upcoming convention to try to establish like some safer space stuff, which is hilarious. But anyway, it's like working with like lawyers and law students, which is kind of wacky because lawyers are not always the best at understanding and respecting how to act in ways that are safer. But I think it's what's interesting is that there's like a group of people doing that, and it's these things kind of come to a head. Like, it's really great to come in and be like, we all respect the same politics, and we want to like have like our values be explicit and make sure that this is a space where everyone feels like they can participate instead of like not having these agreements, so people get implicitly pushed out. So we're gonna like start out and have these great agreements, but like the reality is, like, what happens is that dynamics start surfacing and they come to a head and there's like tension, and then out of that people start thinking about solutions, maybe, but ugly stuff happens before that and people get pushed out, and that's kind of the reality. It's like really hard to get people on board before things get ugly, unfortunately. In this particular situation, there's a group of people who are feeling really proactive, so it's easy to start doing the work with a group who wants to make it happen. And once you start kind of talking about the values in this particular situation, people are like, oh, okay, I can see that, and like it's making it easier to kind of happen, and there's a cultural shift underneath. I think that's really important. Like, just the act of starting to create agreements and starting to talk about these values explicitly, like, there's education that happens, there's like education that you have to do, which can be really hard, and that starts creating a cultural shift in like the groups that you work with to really think about these dynamics and like realize that they're always present and there, and that they have an effect on people. Another example is working with Occupy Wall Street and trying to get a huge swath of people with like very different experiences and values and like having done work in very different ways coming together, and there was a lot of resistance. I'm sorry if this is okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. And it was not the prettiest all the time. But that was, I think, a really interesting experience of understanding that stuff was going on that was really problematic, and at the same time, having a lot of people really resistant to the idea of something that felt to them like policing, and not really thinking about what it might mean to have values that you're sharing, and to think in kind of an alternative context. And so I think that in that case, it was this really long learning experience of trying to say, well, what values do we share? Like, can we create language around it? Can we all agree to it? And then, this took 5 months to like draft something, have it reviewed, have it sent back, have more input, try to go places so that everyone could like give input. It started out in one of the GAs, so you tried to get like hundreds of people to like stay in groups and like give info that we tried to collect. So it was a really long process, and we must have brought the agreement to these meetings like at least 5 times before it passed. So I mean, there was like a lot of dialogue, and there was pushback. We saw the pushback starting to shift because the education process was happening at the same time. So I think it's just really important to think about this as a process, as everything is, and just think about what it might look like to do the education while you're kind of making a space for people to really talk about shared values and talk about what kind of behaviors, not people as individuals or identities, but rather behaviors would exist in a space that would make everyone feel able to participate.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I agree with what you say. I wanted to relate something that we experienced at ABC, which is kind of what you were talking about, the PC police mentality, where people feel like you're actually oppressing them by trying to get them to, agree to be, like to these standards of decency. And a lot of overzealous volunteers that we've had, some of these are like very close friends of mine. I don't want to name names, but we've had volunteers at Norio and our core collective that have permanently alienated, people who aren't bad people, they're just uninitiated. And instead of trying to educate them, they just, kind of go like, fuck you, get out of here, don't come back. And then, we have low attendance, it shows that.
I think that's a really important point, that it's important not to find a way not to come across as policing, and to find, I feel like kicking people out of shows is not necessarily productive. And I say this as someone who has done that before. And there was an incident where this guy who was like pretty well established as a noise musician came to a show at my house, didn't like the band that was playing, and was just bellowing a few homophobic slurs and just general slurs at the top of his lungs. And I said, all right, if you don't like the band that's playing, take a walk. And that blew up into this like daily Facebook rant about how I was a Nazi. I was a Republican somehow.
Obviously.
Yeah, I don't know how that made me a Republican, but I was the oppressor because I was limiting free speech within this show environment. And I feel, on one hand it was good that he left and stopped doing that, but it's also kind of hard to navigate that when that's going to be the response instead of education. What do we do to kind of, not that was obviously a really over-the-top reaction on his part, but I think he kind of expressed really vehemently as something that a lot of these people kind of feel. And I don't know that I have any answers to that question, but I think the important thing is to find a way to kind of plant that seed rather than saying you're not welcome here because you are this. Because if you tell someone you are this, you're bad, you're offensive, then they're automatically going to knee-jerk. As opposed to, I didn't like the way you phrased this, maybe. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of rambling at this point.
I mean, I
Sorry.
can speak to that. I think that one of the most effective and important ways of going about dealing with someone who's being awful is I mean, the best thing is to take them out of that space, to like take them outside, for just be like, you know what, let's go outside, you know, not kicking you out. And in my head, I'm like, yet. But no, it's important that you both or all, depending on how many people are involved, you all like get out of that space for a second and like cool down, and then you're like, look, like you said or you did this thing that hurt somebody else, and I want to talk about it. I've never just straight up like kicked someone out without doing that. In one instance at a show, actually it was a group of men, a couple of whom like played in a band before my band, and they were actually like groping our friends in the audience during our show, during our set, and just like yelling things when I told them to stop. I got down and I'm just like, I'm not doing this right now. You either shut the fuck up or you're gonna leave. And at the time, I was like, you know, let me finish my set and then and then I'll deal with you. But yeah, I mean, we finished the set and we like talked to them and we were like, you've been, you know, you touched our friends in a super inappropriate way. They don't like that. And then they were like, why don't you have video evidence and blah, blah, blah. And they were like getting into our faces and then like, actually, and this was mostly like women coming up to them. And finally, we had like some other men who were also like sticking up for us and being like, yo, what are you doing? And then they immediately started like calling them all kinds of like homophobic things and like trying to fight them. So that was, at that point, we were like, okay, now you really gotta leave and you're not coming back.
Yeah.
We definitely try to de-escalate it. I think it's really important that you aim for like de-escalation, like first thing, that you come in with like, okay, I'm not going to raise my voice, I'm not going to start yelling at you or calling you like a fucking idiot. It's always like important to come in just being like, let's go outside, let's have a talk. That's been the most effective way that I've ever dealt with that. Actually, that was the only time that I felt like violently threatened by people, and that's actually really lucky because I don't hear that. I hear oftentimes when people try to have these discussions, they're often met with violence, so I'm glad that that was like the only instance that I ever came across where it was like that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I just wanted to add is that for me, it feels really important to say that the policing comment is the pervasive attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we need to keep in mind that this is a very common way to silence any kind of activism ever. And I encountered this when I was booking many shows, but I got the same exact comment. And it is not an accident that every single one of us use the word policing, because punks love to hate police, and they love to tell you that you're policing them because it makes you the asshole loser. And I think that's bullshit. And I just feel like I need to say that I think it is very often used as a tool to silence this kind of good faith community effort that's like, hey, we're here we're not here to police anyone. We're here because we're all like electing to be in this public space together, whether it's for one event or whether it's like a policy for a space like ABC. And I was actually in this context, thinking about how there are so few other spaces that I know that have safer space policies that are built in. One other place that I knew of was called 1087 Loft on Broadway for a few years, and I was trying to, as we were talking about this stuff, I was trying to think about what effect that has, that we don't really have any spaces that have this like embedded in it. And I just think it's important to note that there's a reason that we have to have this conversation. There's a reason that we have met this hostility and that we're talking about how to navigate it. And I think everyone has the right idea when they're saying like, you know, all we want to do is educate each other and really be there for each other, because much like the work that Support New York does, like it is not helpful to just ostracize a community member. They're not going to learn anything from that situation. What you want to do is like be there for each other. And I know that sounds like kumbaya or whatever, but you know, the goal is that it's like a longer lasting change. It's not just like throwing someone out of a show. So my personal I guess my note would be that I agree that approaching things with a positive attitude and like the idea of just de-escalating a situation is like the best way to approach it. But I think another best way to approach it would be to have spaces that have these policies already in place and then work on how we enforce them together.
I could throw something in and maybe be slightly paradoxical, but I don't think so. I think like what's something that Susie's pointing out that's important is that you're talking kind of long-term and transformation, and then we're talking short-term and like what's possible in different spaces. I think there's moments where it is necessary to kick people out of spaces.
Yeah.
Like, is it permanent? That's a question. But you're talking about the safety of a room full of people, and you're talking about one person's actions. And I think the point is to create a multiplicity of options for people and to imagine all the options we might have at our disposal. And it's great to try to mediate it and to give those options. It's great to try to create change in one person, but if that's not going to happen in a night, then sometimes you need to make these hard decisions. And maybe there's conditions for people kind of going, you know, whatever those conditions might look like tangibly for what transformation it might take to get people to be able to be in a space and have other people feel safely. But I think it's important for us to think about the fact that inherently sometimes you're going to need to have to do that and give ourselves the flexibility. And also just thinking about policing, I don't know if this is way off base, but I just want to bring up, there's this excellent article called Why Misogynists Make the Best Informants that I recommend everyone read. And I really great point that it makes is that if our communities don't make the effort to you know, find ways to check each other and act in ways that are safe towards each other, it creates great spaces for police to come in and break us apart. So, you know, thinking about what policing means, like if we start envisioning different ways of creating safety that aren't police models, that is an actually effective way to combat police activities.
I don't know if you had something to add. I thought also exactly what you said to this person, like, if this is what you hate right now, then go take a walk, is like a great response in general. Like, that's a good, like, I'm not, you know, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying, like, right now, you clearly need a breath of fresh air. So maybe just take one.
I feel, and the reason I phrased it that way, and the reason I think we have to be really careful with this stuff is if you do start a climate of kicking people out, and I'm saying it would be a climate because if Silent Barn were to institute a safe space policy, and depending on how rigid it was, there would be innumerable infractions in any given night at a noise show. And that's just kind of how it is right now, and it sucks. But what you don't want to do is alienate entire scenes, especially when the scenes are bad and they're ripe for change. And they're really environments where so much change could happen. And the music that is being made would be more interesting, the crowds that turn up to shows would be more diverse. But if you kind of plant that seed, that if you say something that pisses off the PC police, you're gonna get kicked out, then people will just stop booking shows here. So what I'm afraid of is the possibility of kind of creating a walled garden where there are groups of people who could learn a lot from being involved with a space like this, but don't want to be in an environment where they feel like they can't be assholes. And I do think that a lot of the guys I deal with would actually phrase it that way. They don't want to be in an environment where they can't be assholes. And I mean, one question is why I deal with it. But, you know, there's also the fact that I play the kind of music that I play, and I like the kind of music I like. And I believe that change can happen because I don't think the misogyny is an ingrained part of the music. You know, I don't think that, yeah, I know I've come to this discussion without any real answers, but I'm just kind of trying to put that perspective forth to everyone else. Because I think the environments that need the most change are maybe the ones that are kind of the hardest to start working on. Did you have a question? Okay. Oh, I didn't know if that was a hand raised. Yeah?
I think misogyny is ingrained in, you know, everybody in society.
Yeah.
But I kind of agree with what you're saying. That being too rigid, having too rigid of a policy will probably be more harmful than, you know, the kind of good that you want to see from safe space policy. And going back a couple minutes, I just wanted to talk about our the way that we deal with people who violate our safe space policy, the ABC, which is the throw out, come back policy, where
Very interested in this.
if someone has been offended enough at the actions of another person in the show, we'll ask them to leave and then come back to a collective meeting where we'll hear what they have to say to themselves, you know, and if we come to think that, you know, maybe it was like an off day for them, maybe they had a little too much to drink, which is mostly the case, or maybe they just, you know, were misunderstood, which, believe it or not, has happened on a couple of occasions, we'll usually let them back in. Sometimes they won't be let back in, and sometimes, you know, we'll wait a couple of years and then they'll, you know, ask to attend shows again and we'll let them back in. Others, like the singer of Leftover Crack, is not allowed back in the space, but not for an infraction of the safe space policy, only because about 25 years ago he put sugar in the gas tank of another collective member in San Francisco. So he's not that fucked up. But he's still not allowed in the space. And I also I do security in bars. That's what I do for a living, and I can relate to what you said, where you know, a group of men that you approached were, you know, like belligerent to you, but then more belligerent to another group of men. I find that, contrary to what I thought before, men are more willing to, you know, listen to reason when it comes from women. And then they're more likely to throw out like homophobic slurs, and, you know, they sort of feel challenged by other men. It's kind of like I don't know how to explain the phenomenon, but I think it's always best to sort of like try to talk the situation out, but then a lot of the time, talking out a situation is like completely untenable, and you just have to tell the asshole to leave. And there's nothing you can do about it, you know. Assholes are assholes. Sometimes they don't want to listen to what you have to say. Sometimes you don't want to listen to what they have to say. And when you reach that point where there's, you know, no good coming from the conversation, you just have to tell them to fuck off. And, you know, there's really no good way to deal with it. They just fuck off. They feel alienated. That's fine because they're an asshole.
I have a question. I'm wondering if anyone has experience with just saying what a space stands for to prevent such things. So saying this is an anti-racism space, this is an anti-homophobia space, this is an anti-all-around, across-the-board oppression space. So then when someone does act out in a immature, deviant manner, you know, then you can point to the sign, or you can say like, well, do you know where you are, right? And then there isn't going to be any of that, well, you're a Republican kind of.
I still don't know what that was about.
But would that, do you guys think that would help at all? Like, just saying what a space stands for and putting that on the forefront?
Unfortunately, I feel like in the climate I am dealing with a lot of the time, it would meet with mockery. And that's really sad, and yet it's really true. Because there is kind of, and when I say the noise scene, I want everyone to know I don't mean across the board. And I play many, many, many noise shows where it's not like this. But I also play quite a few where it is. where the general vibe is really pretty brewy. It's like this weird bro avant-garde. And it's strange, yeah, it's strange because there is Bravant-garde, I like that.
You say that first. You said it first.
That's
Spencer.
genius.
It's not me.
And that's what, and that's kind of why I like the idea of Silent Barn as a whole, kind of putting this concept forth, because there's so many different kinds of shows booked here. And I feel that kind of having that in place would maybe be the first little bit of armor against that, because it's very common, more so than I think a lot of people realize, for any feminist statement, even if the guys kind of agree with it, there's sort of this like where, you know, it makes my blood boil. And yet, because it's just absolute knee-jerk, and yet if it were kind of put forth that that's not cool, I feel like it wouldn't be hard for things to change, because it's such insecure groupthink when you think about it. And that's all of this broiness really is. But I feel like if the space kind of put forth a little bit more solidly that policy was in place, I feel optimistic that it might bring a little bit of change. Yeah.
If I could speak to that a little bit too, I'm going to say a few things that aren't going to sound easy, so I apologize. It's not the answer you want. I think you have to think in terms of cultural shift in all these things, because it's not going to happen in a day. So it's what has to happen alongside putting up those policies that get people on board. So I think I would encourage you to focus on that. I also think the thing about saying a space is anti-racist, it sounds really great, but the reality is people can do all sorts of racist shit all over the place and say it's not racism, even if to many people who are experiencing that way, it very clearly is. So I think what's helpful for people is to be explicit about the kind of behaviors in that space that should not be tolerated, rather than calling it something that feels like everyone's on board, but in reality, the way people act sometimes perpetuates these things, even if they wouldn't say they're intentionally doing that. And one last point, I know you want to say something, and I want you to say it, but one last point I would quickly make on that is to think about ways that you can create this dialogue, which again, it's long-term work and it sucks, but people who are coming to that space, they want to feel like they have input into whatever the policies are there. So thinking about ways that there can be kind of, and this is tricky, right? Because you don't also want it to be a place for people to be yelling at a mirror and to be triggered, but thinking about ways to encourage the kind of dialogue that would get everyone to come to a place where there's agreement on the kind of behaviors that people want to experience in a space. That's a lot of, that work is really helpful to get everyone towards a policy that they can all stand behind. And when people feel like they have ownership of something, they're much more likely to work in the direction of helping towards it rather than working against it. Oh, can I say one thing quickly too? I think I hear us talking a lot in terms of women and men, and I just want to service that. Believe it or not, in queer communities, these dynamics exist too. So
Yeah.
it's everywhere.
Good point.
I wanted to kind of make a question comment thing. I'm very fortunate that everyone who I'd consider to be a community member is generally on board with safer spaces, but there's been numerous instances where people I've known who've been involved with safer spaces have been people who have perpetrated not good behavior, and I say that because it's not necessarily oppressive, but just the way that they confront people makes other people very uncomfortable, and it just kind of borders on just not appropriate. And then in the city I used to live in, there was a really horrible incident where a punk space that was a safer space policy, that did have a very long-standing safer space policy, handled an instance of assault just in the worst, most reprehensible way, and called the people who came forward feminist bitches, and it was just really awful. And I guess my comment was there is I'm wondering if anybody has experience with how do you actually train people to do safer space work, and what for the people who are volunteering to do that, what what could be enacted to make sure that those people like have de-escalation skills, to make sure that's not just, you're not just paying lip service to it, but that this idea is enacted. Because I think that, at least in my in like my community down, like it was like salt into wounds to have like a safer space community like be enacting this horrible shit, and it just was so much more hurtful in so many ways than if it was just like some apolitical shit scene.
I think it's very, very important to, before an event, like say if you're booking an event and you're inviting a Safer Spaces collective to come in and help do the dirty work for you, or if you're like part of that collective doing that work in a space, I think it's important to meet beforehand and establish like different standards for conduct, not just like in that space in general, but for like each person who's trusted with the responsibility of making it a safer space. Because I've definitely, for a while I did Safer Spaces work at like queer fundraiser parties, and what kept happening was like some Safer Spaces people were like getting drunk and didn't actually really have that much experience. Like they knew all the lingo, they knew the right things to say to someone. They were really chill, so we were like, okay, yeah, we trust you to do this because you're not going to try and like fight someone. But no, I think like it's really, really important to establish standards beforehand, even if they're your friends, even if you're doing this shit with your friends. Like, you should at least be like, hey, can you at least stay sober for like, you know, these 2 hours of the event, or like maybe you can do like a rotation or something. Or like, I mean, I would never, if I knew that someone had perpetrated like some sort of violence against someone, I wouldn't want to work with them, period. But also, I mean, say they're working on it, say you might have someone who's interested in Safer Spaces and did something awful, like they might have like been in an abusive relationship, they might have been an abuser in some situation, and they might be working on it. I don't know, I'd still be like, you know what, you continue to work on this, but let's leave it to somebody who's not, you know, currently going through a process or something like that. Yeah.
So I really quickly wanted to mention that I feel like, you know, we're getting really deep into it, and I like it. But for anyone who hasn't maybe even been in this kind of situation, you might be wondering, like, how would you even enforce this kind of policy in general? And how would you even begin to talk about doing that? And that's kind of what you're asking also. Like, how do you make sure that when you start doing this, you're dealing with the right people? And one thing that I have seen is that everyone's scared to do it. Everyone feels like it's not their job and that they're not qualified and that it should be up to someone else. Not everyone, I mean, saying everyone is like really exaggerating, but I just mean in general, like that's kind of the pervasive, scary idea, is that like, I don't know how to do this, let's leave it up to the professionals type idea. Something that has been helpful for me is, for some of us are getting older and some of us can identify community members that have done social work or counseling, and those are usually the first people that I go to if they're like in my immediate, like say I knew that a collective member of Silent Barn had gone to like got their master's in social work or something, I'd be like, that's the person that I would want to talk to. Of course, it's amazing to have people in your community that like professionally have been trained to do this. That's obviously not always the case. Part of it is, like Susie said, really just like getting together as a group. Once you are establishing this policy, sitting down and saying, okay, well, we need to talk about exactly how we're gonna relate to people when they approach us. First of all, we should probably all be sober. You know, just kind of, you need to establish like some guidelines for what this should be like. And it has a lot to do with the things that we were saying, like, if you end up in a situation where someone feels hostile, how do you then react? What do you then say to them? What is the first move? And who who is willing to be a person that can do that?
I think I have an answer for that,
Bring it.
but I also have a question because I've never been here before. How is the space run? Anybody?
I have the answer.
Everyone turns around.
I'm a member of here. It's run collectively, so each person has a specific role and has autonomy over a specific space or part or responsibility, and we make all of our decisions based on consensus. It's very large. We have like about 50 members.
So it's like a larger ABC No Rio. No one wants to go to Manhattan anymore. If you guys have 50 members, I would say if you enact like a safer space policy, maybe you could do something the same way that they do at Gilman Project, where they have two or more, I think, collective members at every event that volunteer to do security. And I think that, you know, I've been working in security for, you know, years, for most of my adult life, and I think that most of the time, you know, most of the job isn't like, you know, beating people up and, you know, throwing them down flights of stairs. It's usually like approaching someone and explaining to them why their actions are, you know, wrong in that environment, and asking them to correct their behavior, asking them to leave. And, you know, then usually the other stuff comes after that in a lot of cases, because in my experience, adults, after having a couple drinks, I would say about 50% of them act like infants.
I actually, I would like to say a short bit about drinking at events. Haha. But no, actually, I mean, Safer Spaces isn't just about observing other people's behavior, or rather observing where they go wrong in certain spaces, but also identifying certain like vulnerable situations. I have always like prioritized, like, you know, scoping out the event that I'm at and making sure that, like, if I see someone who looks like they're sick in the corner, or, you know, they look like they're about to yak, or they're like, I mean, I've definitely like gone and, like, you know, taking care of people who like passed out in corners and stuff. Like, just don't leave people behind and alone, because also, I mean, that's like, that's just like one of the rules of being a good bystander in general, but especially like given the rate at which like sexual assault happens, it's like also a good preventative measure in a space. If you see someone who's passed out, I mean, seriously, I go to so many shows where like you might find someone just like totally out of it, even if they're not totally like blacked out on the floor. Like, I mean, they might be totally out of it and like not doing well at all. So I might approach someone and be like, hey, you want me to get a glass of water? Do you want me to help you over to the bathroom? Is there anything you need? If they're not awake, then I'm like, oh shit, you know, and I get someone else, and I'm like, okay, who knows this person? If I don't know this person, like, we need to find out who they came with. That's another super important thing that people don't do enough of, is like looking after people, especially if they've been drinking.
Really quick, another thing that I'm really glad you brought that up, just to think, we have to think outside of like just personal situations, and also think about like where venues are located, and is it safe for people to get to and from the venue. And, you know, I don't know if any of you all are familiar with this group called Strength in Numbers, but it's run by Karen Soskin, and she is a tour manager now, so she doesn't do as many events in New York as she used to. But what Karen would do is anytime she was having a show, she had 2 escorts waiting at the subway to walk people to the venue. And that was actually at the old Silent Barn. She did that a lot. And that kind of thing, I think, is really important. I think that's also really looking out for community safety. And that is something that I never see. But it's just another thing to think about. Like, especially if, you know, I know, especially a lot of DIY spaces, like, you need to stay closed before the show can happen. You need to, you know, you're protecting the space, but there are people that are coming that also need to be protected. So just thinking about accessibility kind of inside and outside the venue.
I do think that sort of thing would help make the environment more welcoming at certain shows too. Because I think a lot of the shows I find myself playing, the ones that are 90% straight white men, there's a reason they're like that. And there's a reason that scene is that way, and it's not necessarily because of the music. And I think if there was greater outreach and there was more effort, then the scene would be able to get more diverse because people would feel. I think there's just a necessity to kind of reach out to people, especially within certain scenes where it hasn't really happened. And where one downfall, I think, I've been involved with setting up a lot of shows that are kind of female-centric within noise and experimental music, just kind of explicitly focusing on female and queer musicians. And the problem with that, when you're dealing with this kind of like misogynist stronghold, is the audience you get ends up being preaching to the choir. And I think at a space like this, if you were to kind of implement a policy saying there will be somebody on hand that you can come to if you feel alienated, there will be somebody to walk you to the train, that might be a good first step too, to kind of reach that handout. Yeah, I like that.
Cool. Yeah, so I feel like through all the questions that I had come up with and different ideas that we talked about with the folks that threw this event and also between ourselves, we covered a lot of it. So it is 9:17. I just feel like if folks want to jump in with questions, now that is great. Yeah.
Cool. There's something that we were touching on earlier about PC versus having an actual intent for a safer space and sort of the language. And I was at a workshop much earlier out of state where someone was trying to define both of those things and kind of show the distinction, because obviously for people who are really new to this, or it's the knee-jerk reaction, there is no distinction between those two things. So I think having clear language around those might help. Be like, being PC is just trying to cover your ass to look good, and safer space is giving a shit about people. Or like, how do we dig into those definitions to kind of separate them so that those bros sort of like at least understand that these are not the same thing, even if they're not supportive immediately. So that just doesn't help.
Maybe I'm in the minority here. I kind of feel like PC is people's ways of dismissing like very real concerns that people have. Like I'm very hesitant to define PC as some thing that's bad and it's this thing people do. Because the way I see people using that kind of accusation is when people surface very real concerns that they have, and it's a way to kind of, much like you surface with policing, people use these terms that sound bad to kind of dismiss and not hear the content of what someone's saying. I think it's possible that people can, make use of anything, because people can make use of anything to gain power. So I think it's possible that people can twist this kind of intent into ways that could be, gaining personal power but not actually helpful for our community. But I would encourage us to be very cautious with like throwing around accusations of PC, and to kind of step back and be like, try to hear what people are saying and parse it out and be like, what here is a real concern around safety, and where is that coming from, and to try to kind of give people that.
Did you want to speak directly to
I
that?
can wait.
Okay.
We just, sorry, just use the mics for recording purposes if you have questions.
Oh, sure.
I was just saying that, like in response to what you said, I didn't mean in like a reductive way. That it'd just be like, this is a racism-free, idealistic, polite, kind zone of goodwill and good intentions, and just by writing that on the walls, magically with fairy dust, like everything is going to be great. But in everyone's like experience, defining a space and just really analyze it in a very nuanced way, what it means, like what's happening here, and just really digging deep, and then having these kind of simplistic guidelines, so when someone doesn't act, a very Cro-Magnon reaction to like something called, say, homophobic slurs or whatnot, then they can be pointed to. That goes against our policies, and then people who are asking them to leave, they won't be faced with, why are you policing me? It will be already defined when they come into the space. And in your spaces, have you guys ever tried that out or seen it work? And is Silent Barn planning on enacting that in the future? Thanks.
You have one.
We have our safe space policy posted outside of the building. We put it on a lot of flyers, not every flyer, but we used to have a sign inside the gallery, but I think we lost it along with the no glass bottles sign. And the bank drinking in the space, but I think wording is important too. I think if you get too wordy or too intellectual, a lot of people aren't going to understand it. You guys are in Bushwick, I mean, I'll speak for the white straight bros of New York City public school system that didn't go to college. I don't understand a lot of what I read in literature, and I do my best, but I have to have people break things down for me, and I want to know what I'm reading when I read feminist theory. And a lot of people, they have good intent, but they don't have the vocabulary or the intellectual means to understand literature and signage and stuff like that. So I think before what I said was no sexism, racism, or homophobia. It's up to vast interpretation. It's really vague, but I think most people kind of get the feeling. They know what the sign is about, and they kind of can deduce from that sign that it also refers to other behaviors that are in sort of the same category that they shouldn't. And if they don't, you can correct them. But I think it's really important to recognize intent in what people say and do. And I know I'm kind of playing devil's advocate right here, and some people might not like what I'm saying, but I think that it's better to include people who are not really menacing, just uninitiated, than to exclude them altogether and have them be like, fuck these assholes, fuck these feminist whatever, this and that.
I tend to think that having an established policy in a space really helps in any place that I've been. I mean, I spent my youth at ABC as well, as a Long Island girl who traveled to the city. And I have gotten in fights with people there, and those people have been kicked out.
I thought you were familiar.
But it was intense, but I kind of knew, if I told the right people that it should work out right. You know what I mean? And as someone who was literally a teenage girl when this was happening, and for all intents and purposes, teenage girls don't really have anyone in their corner. To know that, at least in this space, I shouldn't really totally get fucked over is a big deal. So I do think there's a lot of power in naming just what you want out of a space and making that obvious to people. And like you said, I think it should be simple to understand. But I do think it's helpful. That was actually when we were working on the questions for this panel. One of the folks from Silent Barn mentioned that they wanted to discuss implementing event-based safer space policies versus what's the difference between having an event-based safer space policy versus a permanent one. For me, I don't really know, because anytime that I've booked a show, it's just been my own situation where I don't own a venue. So I've had to say, okay, I'm running this show, this is how it's gonna go, and I'm lucky enough to have had prior relationships with the people whose venues I was using, and I would tell them and it was fine. But I would imagine that it's not that easy for everyone, and also that it would be way helpful if there were spaces that, beyond ABC that had more of these policies.
I feel strongly that it should be a space-based policy instead of event-based, because the events that need it the most are the ones whose organizers are not going to care.
Yep.
So I feel like it should really be the entire space, but that's just my 2 cents.
No, I think that's a really good point, especially kind of what I'm talking about as being someone who's temporal. I don't have anywhere that I'm necessarily always booking my shows. I don't have somewhere that I'm totally associated with. I would be really confident knowing that, you know, somewhere like Silent Barn, I know like when I'm going to ABC, what I'm getting into, that there is a policy already in place, and I can feel comfortable knowing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for spaces to do that or to offer that. You eventually build like a good rapport, not only with like the bands that you might bring in or like the performers that you might bring in, but also with people who would feel comfortable going to that space. Like I know a lot of bands, and my band is included, where we don't play at places that will not allow us to, that don't already have a safer spaces policy in place, or that won't let us like invite other people to do that. So I think it also, I mean, it definitely impacts also the people who attend shows and events.
All right, so are there any other questions or anything that we haven't touched on that anyone wants to jump in with? In the audience, on the panel?
I thought it was really important that folks brought up the idea that you can have a safer space policy in a space, but what happens when you go outside, and thinking about strategies there. I want to give props to Right Rides, which is a great organization that can offer rides to almost anyone. I think cisgender men cannot get that service, unfortunately, but cisgender straight men. But Right Rides does a great job offering everyone a free ride home. So I think it's a great organization. I think it gets really complicated, right? Where we start talking about, like, you have to start and build out of who you work with, right? And you can start building these policies. But, you know, when you get on the street, all bets are off, and that's real. I also want people to think about, like, what all the different networks that exist. We're talking about one space and one certain community. But there are communities and networks that exist in neighborhoods. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about what safety means for certain people in neighborhoods, we're kind of acting like there's a dearth of other communities and networks there. So I think thinking about all the different ways that safety happens is really important. Thinking about what it means for a lot of different people, and especially we live in neighborhoods that are changing. Thinking about what, you know, the effects of many different people's presence means, and just making sure that when we talk about safety, we're talking about a safety that, you know, is a safety for everyone. And I think part of this work is building within our networks and starting to talk about safety there, but then thinking broadly and thinking about, you know, engaging our other communities too. You can have a safer space policy here, but, you know, working with your neighbors and thinking about what that means, and just making sure that you know, when you walk outside, you have a lot of people you can engage with, you know, to connect with.
Yeah, I think definitely we're in New York and we have a lot of resources, and that's something that's been important in even gathering people on this panel together. Like, it's just awesome that, you know, that ABC is still around, and that, I mean, I feel like Leah has actually worked with like every single safer space or like support-based group in New York. Well, almost. So there are a ton of resources, and I'm definitely open to talking to folks at Silent Barn that just, if you need help figuring out like what other policies have been, or who you can talk to about setting stuff up. There's a lot out there. We are very lucky. But yeah, if that's all from everyone, then I think we're all set. Thank you so much for having us, Silent Barn. High fives, high fives. Oh, I'm gonna send one this way now. You have to go down the row.
I think I got it. Go back.
Send it back.
Oh.
All right.
Oh yeah, and just in time out.
I'm very solo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I love the name Shady Moments.
Thank you for doing it. That went amazing.
I'm so glad.